right, Jennifer Gregg. So we call you Jen, right? Isn't that what we normally call you, Jen? Is that what do people call you, Jen or Jennifer?
Everybody who knows me calls me Jen.
Yes. So, because I saw that that was how you actually, at the end of your emails, you would say Jen. So let's call you Jen.
And I'm a
So,
unique Jen in English because I spell it with one N, which is not how it's usually spelled in English. It's usually
oh,
spelled with two, but my brother's name is Ben.
yeah.
My older brother's name is Ben. So when I was learning to write my name, I would not have put an extra N because he didn't have an extra N. So
And I think I wrote with two N's.
it's okay. It turns out
Oh,
it's pronounced exactly the same, so it
oh,
doesn't matter. When I write it, I usually write it with one N, which is very unusual. But I don't expect other people to spell it that.
well, but to be well, you are in a unique gen. Let's just look
Yeah.
at where you are a unique gen. And so, guys, like if you're joining this, you probably know what this is. This is called Cocktails and Courageous Conversations. Basically, it's just two people getting together in a bar, having a little cocktail. For Jen, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. And so, what we always say is that cocktails are optional, courage is guaranteed. And so it's an informal chat with my guests and myself. My name is Ricky. I am a psychologist and act trainer and very passionate about teaching and supervising in act. And I cannot like this is why I have so look forward to this, and I've brought the tissues, Jen, because what we're going to talk about is very special, and I know that a lot of people are here because of what we're going to talk about. And so let's get to that in a minute. But before we start, would you mind telling people who you are? For those who may not know you yet, who's Jen?
Yes. So I'll start with my sort of the act pieces of my identity. Um, in 1995, I'm dating myself totally here. In 1995, I was an undergrad in at the University of Nevada, and I took a summer class taught by this graduate student named Robin Walzer.
Robert Walls.
Isn't that so funny? And it was like a survey of different types of psychotherapy class. And Robin taught about ACT in this class, which in 1995, people weren't teaching about ACT in these kinds of classes. But because she was in Steve's lab, she taught about ACT in this class. And I was like, oh, as I think a lot of us have this moment, right? I don't know if you have, Ricky, but
Yes.
like this moment of like, oh, yeah, that's how it works for me. Um, and so I am very, very not, I was just extremely naive. I didn't know all kinds of things. And so I called Steve on the phone because I asked Robin how I found out more about this theory, and she said, "Oh, you're in luck. The guy who does this is here." So I called Steve on the phone, and I said, "I would like to get some training in ACT." I mean, an undergrad, that was not something that happened, and is kind of ridiculous. But he was very nice,
Can I just
and
stop
he
and say I love what you were saying. Like I just got on the phone. I just called Steve Hayes, as one does,
because I had no idea. Like if
as
I'd
one does.
known, there's no right, but I didn't know, so I was like, "Oh, okay, I'm supposed to call this guy and ask him about it." So I called him on the phone and he said, well, we don't usually do that with undergrads. And I said, but I'm really, really interested. And he was like, okay, well, probably you should come to a lab meeting. And I didn't even know what that meant, but I was like, okay,
Okay.
just tell me where to go. And I show up at his lab meeting and they're talking about RFT. And I did not understand a single word that anybody was saying about anything, but I'm kind of nodding along. I mean, I was, let's see, 95, I was 22. So I'm nodding, like, yes, of course, that makes a
Sure.
lot of sense. And
Arbitrarily applicable to rival relations.
right, all of the words. And after the lab meeting, I said, "So, okay, can I go to this workshop that you have, this weekend workshop that he was offering?" And he said, "Well, I guess so, but it's experiential, you know." And I didn't know what that word meant. And I said, "Oh, of course, right." So then I realized what the word meant, and I was like, uh-oh, what have I gotten myself into? And I went and spent a random weekend in the woods with a bunch of psychologists, and that was it.
Wow.
Like, that was, I mean, I never, like, that was relatively early. And I mean, I was still an undergrad long before I'd figure out what I wanted to do for graduate school. And I just happened upon this random class taught by Robin. And
Wow.
that was kind of it. And I ended up staying there and going to graduate school there with Steve. And my eventual niche was that I was always really interested in people who were medically sick. Um, and so that was sort of where I brought a lot of ACT stuff early on before it had sort of ventured very wide.
And I know that you've written articles and books and self-help, like you've done a lot. One of them I have here. I love that it's I love that it's small. Uh,
It is tiny.
It is tiny and it's very handy. And I just wanted to give a little shout out. I know you were too modest to do it, Jen. And so you wrote this with Lisa Coyne and Matt Boone, right?
Right.
I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation. And I got to read it. You were so
Yeah, you were
kind, and
great.
yeah, you asked me to read it and do a little blurb, I think it's called. Anyway, people, this is a very cool book. Stop avoiding stuff, 25 microskills to face your fears and do it anyway. I love this book and I love it because it's very easy to read. It's quite personal. I love that about like you can actually see that there are people, like it's not just authors, it's like people who are you get quite personal, and it's very sweet, and it's very it's what can I say? It's manageable. Like every chapter has, and then you go and do this, and then you go and do this, and it's like it's easy to read. It's manageable. It's great for therapists because there's so much to learn in that, and then it's great for clients as well. So go get this book. And our own Jen is one of the authors. It is also has two N's. Can you see that?
The Jennifer, you're right. That's why
Yes.
people
Yeah.
spell Jennifer with two N's because
Yes.
it is two N's in Jennifer. Right.
But now we know, like the people in here, we know that you're special.
You're in the
It's
know.
actually just with one N. All right. So,
So I will say about the book, just because I think it's funny, we really, for a long time, we were going to call it the ACT bathroom book because the chapters are like a couple pages long each one, and they have like a little task at the
they're
end.
very
And we
bathroom
thought it
friendly.
was kind of the perfect amount, the perfect length chapter for a little time in the bathroom. So
Yeah.
if you need a little reading material in your bathroom, that might be what it's good for.
Oh, I love that. Well, I understand why you would say that. It makes sense because it is very edible in that way that it is small doses and I love it. I loved it. And so you'll see that in the blurb. If you get it, you'll see that I wrote that this is a book to read. Really, it
Yeah.
is a book to read.
Ricky was one of the most lovely contributors to things
But
that.
I really loved it. And so it's a great book. And so
So
you
before you jump in, I know you want
yes.
to ask questions, but because you and I don't know each other that well, um, I told you how I came to ACT. How did you
Yes.
come to ACT?
Oh, I came to ACT actually before I even finished the psychology studies. I've stumbled upon it might have been an article or something like that. And then I started working with a company in Sweden called Psychology Partners. And they
Right.
were actually the ones who arranged the very first
I
WorldCon,
remember.
yeah, in 2003. And they were like ready to, I think they were almost bankrupt. They were risking everything to put together this conference. So I just came
This
into
is
a
the
conference.
Linköping.
Pardon? Yes, Linköping,
Linköping.
exactly. So I came into this company and they were like living and breathing act, and they still are. I'm not there anymore, but they still are. And so many of them did act. And one of my mentors, he's Thomas Gustafson. He's the one who co-wrote the Focused Act book. And so I was literally thrown into it, and they sent me away to see Steve Hayes like the very first week, and then they, sent me to Kelly and Kirk, and we had, Christmas and Midsummer's with Kelly and Kirk because they were like visiting the company all the time. Send me to Nicholas Turniker, who's been my supervisor and great friend. So, and I, like you, I probably didn't understand the magnitude or and how privileged and honoring it is. I was just like, yeah, I'm hanging out with these guys. So while I am pretty, uh, then I've done act for quite a while now. And the thing is that I don't know anything else because I have like been, I don't know if I can say this on air, but I have been breastfed act. It's like, since I was a baby psychologist, I was breastfed act. And so I've had the opportunity to join all these trainings, and very very soon I started doing training. I always loved being on stage. Like before we went on, we were just talking about you and me, right? When in Berlin I got on stage and I was doing something, and there was a lot of people coming on stage, including your daughter, I think. uh,
Yes.
so I've always loved being on stage and doing, theater and music and all of that. And so they send me out doing a lot of trainings. And one, if you want to, this this not may not be a rule for everybody. For me, if you want to get good at act, if you start teaching it, you have to know the theory and play with it. So that's how it started for me. And it wasn't until quite a while later that I found out, oh my God, I'm hanging out with Steve and Kelly and Kirk and Robin and you and amazing people. And it wasn't until later I found out how big of a privilege that is. So that's how I started.
I'm so gonna steal that breastfed act because I was too.
Yes, yes. And so I haven't really done anything else like within the psychology. I came into psychology pretty late because I was traveling the world first. But yeah, and so that's how it started for me. And I was like sobbing. Like the first workshop was with Steve Hayes, and I didn't understand, I think 90% of it. I I didn't, I don't think if you come to your first experiential workshop and you're not, like you were saying, you don't know what to expect. I was absolutely blown away and like crying most of the time. And I felt this, I think you said something the similar, like I felt this like I came home. It was like, this is so what I want to do. And so I took it from there.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I've met you a few times. There's actually a picture of you and me from, is it Dublin, right? Uh,
Dublin.
where we are. And so, guys, we just want to tell you this, that we were in Dublin for the World Conference. It must have been like 2019, I think now, yeah.
Yeah.
And so for the ACBS World Conference, and one event was that they had hired the entire church. It's a cathedral, it's
I think
humongous.
it's a relatively well known.
Very big. And they hired that for the poster session. So we had all those people presenting their posters, and then all of us, walking around, mingling, having drinks. So there's actually a picture of you and me, Robin Walser, Jackie Pistorello, and a few other women having a drink in a cathedral in Dublin. That is
Yes.
pretty
If
awesome.
I remember right, there was some excessive drinking in that church.
Well,
And I'm not saying
the,
neither was you, neither of us, but I do remember. I actually that church came back later to Matt Boone and I were the program chairs for the 2020 ACBS conference,
yes.
and um, before we knew everything was going to get moved online, which was, had its own challenges, it was originally set to be in New Orleans, and we were trying to help the staff think about what kinds of events to hold for the conference. And we were like, those guys killed us in Ireland. Like, we're never going to be able to compete with drinking wine in a church.
It's really, I can highly recommend it. I don't know if we'll ever be able to do this again, but it was amazing. And to say, like, just to add to what you're saying, that there was excessive drinking, people like literally there were waiters coming with trays of drinks all of the time. So
Yeah.
I'm not
It
saying
was
we're
being
not
forced.
responsible, but I'm just saying that you know, drinking was easy accessible, and yeah, it was a lovely event, a lovely
Yeah.
event. All right. And so one of the so the topic of today's webinar is called acting in life's scariest moments. And when I spoke to you on email and we talked about this webinar, I was crying, and I wrote to you like, I will, you know, I'd love to do this, and there will be crying because of 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 some, I will say that often when we do act, we do get emotional. Well, I cry a lot. I get very emotional for a variety of reasons. This subject is, I admire your work so much, Jen, and it's a subject that scares me a little bit, like death. It's literally so, I'm so afraid of it, and so I have imagined what it would be like to be in a setting where you are surrounded by, in this instance, cancer patients, their families, and it's a very special context. And I'm just so moved that you wanted to come in here and talk to us about it, because well, first of all, we want to hear what it's like for you, but also like teach us a little bit. Well, teach us, but educate us in like, how do you carry yourself in all of this? How do you carry the families, and how do you carry the patients? And so could you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in here?
Sure. So, since about 2002, most of my work has been um, with folks who've been diagnosed with cancer and their families. I'd say since about 2007, all of my work has been with those folks. Um, and I think in some ways, this population, let me just say from the beginning, I've always felt it's a little bit like if you're an ACT therapist, it's a little bit cheating because a lot of times in ACT, part of what we're struggling with is helping people find emotion and really powerfully connect with it and to think about what's most meaningful for them. And so I think there is often, not always, but often something about a life threatening diagnosis that brings some of that stuff present right away. So in some ways, it's a little bit, I find this to be a population that I've always, like, since my first cancer patient, have loved this content because there is a fair amount of emotion. And I think this, you said a second ago, like, it's really scary and it's something that we are really afraid of. And we're sort of, we're set up to be afraid of this. There's no distortion here. There's no, if somebody receives a diagnosis that their life may be cut short, I think that process is like really, really scary. I had a wonderful patient once who came to me and said, I've had a prolonged period of depression where I was pretty suicidal and I got some cognitive therapy and it helped tremendously because I could see my sort of errors in my thinking and I could just apply those rules and I started feeling better. And she got this, she was young, she had very small children, and she got a lung cancer diagnosis, pretty bad, like pretty poor prognosis, lung cancer diagnosis. And she said, none of my cognitive therapy skills are working. And so we sort of did this work of like, of course, because this isn't a distorted view of the world. Like something extremely scary is happening. And you have that, the things that show up in that context are lots and lots of stuff about identity, lots and lots of fear and regret and pain and sadness and sort of preemptive loss, and a lot of sort of thinking about what the rest of your life is going to look like and how that's going to go. And I think particularly maybe for people who don't have a lot of contact with their values, this is this amazing thing that ACT can bring to give people a place that they can put their focus on, that is about what's going to happen next. Because from the time you get diagnosed until whatever's going to happen is often way longer than people expect.
Yeah.
And so that's where I would say the powerful work happens in that context, that the ability to think about like, okay, so, rather than thinking about, very far down the line, what's going to happen, I'm going to die, what's that going to be like? That's going to be there. But you have a ton of movement that you can make here, which again is just a very ACT perspective, but is one that if you don't come in with that, in my experience, is just extremely powerful for people who are facing the end of their life.
Oh, I can imagine. And so what is it like, what out of curiosity, again, I said I'm so afraid of this, and I would um I fear that I would find it so difficult to handle myself. What is it like for you to be in a context where this is mostly where your job is done?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's a great question. It is extremely sad.
Hmm.
Um, in some ways, it's sort of sad in a different way, because all of the patients that I've met, I've treated, probably thousands of cancer patients at this point. Um, Everybody I meet, I know, could be gone. That doesn't, if you do clinical work, that you love those patients with all of your heart, hopefully not romantically, but like,
Hmm.
that experience. In fact, this is fresh for me right now because a patient who I've seen for many years, who was diagnosed with ovarian cancer and made it through the treatment and was in remission for a couple of years, and then it came back, and then she fought for another 6 years. Just passed away on Monday, so it's very present. It is very sad, and I think, and again, I think this might have something to do with being an ACT person and maybe breastfeeding that way. Um, I'm okay, like I can have sad
Hmm.
pretty easily. I once was at a funeral of a patient who was another patient that was very young and had small children and was just a very tough death. And, funerals are a little bit challenging for me because confidentiality doesn't die with the patient. So I have to be sort of careful about attending funerals of my patients because my presence can sometimes reveal the relationship in a way that I have to be really mindful of. So I often, if it's a patient that I was particularly connected to and saw for a long time, then to take care of myself and to be able to keep doing the work, I usually go to the funeral if I can. But I kind of sneak in at the last minute and I sit in the back and I kind of sneak out right as it's ending. I don't stay for receptions or talk to people. And so I had snuck in to this funeral of this young woman who I saw for a long time. And the place the funeral was being held at was very crowded and it was very, very hot. And the officiant who was performing the ceremony clearly did not know this woman very well. And so I'm standing there at that funeral, and I'm just kind of noticed myself and my body not quite being very comfortable. And I kind of checked in and was like, okay, well, I'm feeling hot. I'm feeling uncomfortable because I'm standing because there were no more chairs. I'm feeling annoyed because this guy did not know her and he's talking about himself. And I'm feeling sad. And I realized standing there, like, of all of those emotions, like sad was fine. Like, I was much more concerned about solving hot
Hmm.
or, uncomfortable or irritated. That I think, like, sad is just part of the deal. And I will say with this one particular woman, I had been with her on the day that she died, and her liver was failing, and she was in the hospital, which is rare for my patients. Usually, people pass at home, and she was pretty scared, and I. She asked her husband to step out, and we sat for a minute. And she, as I said, she had really small children, and she said, "I'm really scared that I'm going to be replaced. Like, I know that this is the end." And out of nowhere comes this, like, big fear that my kids are going to forget me, and that my husband's going to move on, and that I'm going to be replaced. And in that moment, like, what turned out to be a couple hours before she died, we sort of together kind of came back to where she was, felt her body, noticed what all these feelings were, kind of listed through them one by one, made some room for them, and then talked about how she wanted to show up to that situation. And she called her husband back in, and she said, "Please love as big as you can. Please show the kids what that looks like for the rest of their lives. Like, this, all that matters to me is that you use your heart after I'm gone." Which was so difficult for her to say, but was so consistent with her values.
I Here we go. I'm just like, I, thank you so much for sharing this with us. Like, what an amazing gift it must be to to be on one's deathbed, with all this, and then you're there with her, holding her hand, and being with her in this, and helping her to say that, please love big.
Yeah,
That is one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard, and very, very sad.
yeah. And so amazing. Like,
Yes.
to get to be part, I mean, just the number of kind of people who have, I had this one patient once who had a similar kind of story. He came to me because he had been diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer and had a very poor prognosis. And when he found out about the diagnosis, he attempted suicide. And so they stabilized him, and then they told him that to get treatment, he had to see me to get physical treatment. Sometimes people only get to get their chemo if they see me.
Yeah.
And so he did not really want to see me, is the point. And he came to me, and he was very analytical, and he was very he really wanted to, if from an ACT perspective, I guess we would say, like, all of his control strategies were sort of figure it out, solve it, make all the feelings go away. And um, in fact, he came back the second session and said, "I Googled you." And I know all about ACT and how it relates to CBT, and he really wanted to talk about ACT in general because he had Googled me. And we ended up, he turned out he had, like, lived this teeny tiny life, like, so scared all the time, so very, like, afraid. He'd been with a partner for a very long time, never fully committed. He'd sort of, taken jobs that were not probably what he wanted because he thought that they were safe. And he had been having some distress. Had stomach aches, and he had gone to his doctor and said, "I think something's wrong with my stomach." And he was pretty overweight. And she said, "You just need to lose some weight." And he came back a few months later and said, "I really think something's wrong with my stomach. I just don't feel right." And she said, "You really need to lose some weight." And then it turned out that he had this very advanced pancreatic cancer. And, you know, Americans are relatively litigious in these kinds of situations. And so by the time he got to me, he was really kind of contemplating how to kind of trying to, I think probably on some levels trying to punish her for not taking him seriously in this extremely painful way, which was to tell him that he needed to lose weight. And when we started talking about his values, he identified with something that's called steampunk. Do you know what this is?
No.
It's like apparently, he had to teach me about it. It's some kind of movement that has to do with the integration of technology and sort of early 19th century sort of culture. So like, you know, steamboats and like that kind of era. Anyways, he was very interested in this idea of steampunk. So we started spending a lot of time, as you do as an ACT therapist, talking about like, what are the values in there for you? What about that connects? And he decided that it was honor and integrity and sort of chivalry, and that he really felt like those were the parts of steampunk that were most personally meaningful for him. So without even discussing it with me beforehand, he goes to the doctor's office of the woman who had misdiagnosed him. He hadn't spoken to her since he'd gotten his diagnosis, but he knew she knew about his diagnosis. And he just showed up without an appointment to her office. And the front desk staff said, you know, she can't see you. She's with patients. And he said, I will wait. And he waited there all day. And at the end of the day, she finally like couldn't avoid him. And he walked into the exam room to see her. And I think she knew that he was getting a lot of advice that he should sue her for this misdiagnosis. And he walked right up to her and said, everybody makes mistakes, and I don't blame you at all. And I completely absolve you of any guilt. Like, nobody is perfect, including me and including you. And he walked away. And he died like a week later. Like, that was his gift to her, so that for the rest of her life, she wouldn't sort of feel badly about that.
I like I I'm struggling to find the words, and I wanted to say, and it might sound misplaced, but for me, like, you are a rock star, because, and also see in the comments here, people are saying you're so strong. How can you hold something that is so big? Like, what what amazing work you are doing to give people this gift of living, like literally living until they're
Yeah.
not living anymore. Um, what an amazing, I am in awe of the things that you're doing. What does
Well,
that
I
look?
appreciate that. Although I don't think I mean, I think this work, that is what we do. I just happen to do it with a lot of patients who sort of need that message in that
Yeah,
moment. You know, again, it's a
yeah.
little bit cheating because they all are ready for that message so well. They're so open to it.
So what is it that you, so I know many of the people who are watching this, they are therapists, either ACT therapists or people like interested in ACT and wanting to do more ACT. Could you tell us a little bit about like what are some of the, maybe an exercise or typical questions that you would ask? I know that you'd say it's ACT and it's in this setting, but just out of curiosity, what does it look like when our special Jen makes does ACT?
Well, I think, I mean, I'm not sure how to answer it, so I will answer it. I have for 10 years, I had run and have run a terminal illness group with folks who've been diagnosed with, we don't call it the terminal illness group anymore, we call it the chronic illness group. But originally it was called the terminal illness group. So people who have been diagnosed with something that they probably won't be cured from. And who have the like very complicated job of going on and living their lives and continuing to do day-to-day things with this kind of big giant piece. So in answer to your question, I'm trying to think of what they would say, because
Yeah.
I've done ACT with them for an extremely long time. What they would say might be like influential work that we do. One thing is that there's a lot of spending time talking about values.
Yeah.
And values is a funny thing because if, as we know, if you don't have a lot of exposure to values, then that is a really revolutionary way to think about it,
Yeah.
to think about things. And so coming up with kind of very moment by moment ways for people to show up in their lives that feel meaningful. I genuinely think that in the context of this kind of diagnosis, that work and just a really consistent drumbeat of that work allows people a place that they have some control
Yeah.
in a situation that often is very full of helplessness and uncertainty.
Yeah.
That there's not very much you can do about your cancer. And so we do a ton of work in values specifically, helping people think about how do you want to show up today. And it's interesting, like some of the things that we might do with somebody who doesn't have these diagnoses sometimes needs to be modified a little bit. Like I have people who aren't in romantic relationships who would like to have a romantic relationship, but dating when you have chronic cancer is pretty tricky. And so we do a thing that's called 40 dates where they have to, if this is their value, then the assignment is that they go on 40 dates. They don't go find their person because they may or may not find their person, but they go on 40 dates and we take the pressure off of the outcome and more onto the process of them being able to live those from like, I want to be somebody's partner values in a way that might be like, first of all, it's very hard to do online dating with the purpose of finding someone. Like that kind of ruins the experience for most people. So instead we just have like, people to keep track of their tally and they go on dates and this is an experience and they meet some people and and the goal then becomes hitting 40 instead of finding the person. And so the values piece is really shifting to, like even, and literally I've seen people who have extremely poor prognosis cancer who have run for political office or who have done a marathon or who've done really extraordinary things. But I've also just seen 1,000 little miracles of like, I showed up. I asked somebody to spend time with me. I, went for a walk when I wasn't sure if I was going to fall down. There's a lot of extreme bravery that happens in this context that when it's value driven brings a lot of vitality to a situation where people often feel pretty zapped of their vitality.
Whoa, I love so this is so inspiring. Like first of all, like what you're pointing to is like the process rather than I love the idea of 40 dates. It takes up the pressure of finding your partner, uh, but going on dates with or with life as it is right now. I love the questions about how do you want to show up today? How do you want to show up to this? You actually said that before when you were describing with this woman that you were with her just hours before she passed away and she asked her partner to love big. I heard that you actually asked her, how do you want to show up to this sadness and grief and fear that you are sitting with right now? This is so
Right.
powerful stuff. Really powerful stuff. I just wanted to see, like, there are so many comments. We have Ancha, she's calling you strong. And she also asked, do you ever ask how people want to be remembered or how come they are okay with, um, just out of curiosity, do you ask people how they want to be remembered?
I do, although I don't, I think that's a complicated question for
Yeah,
people,
yeah,
because it's about something that they don't have control over.
yes,
and like the piece they do have control over is how they show up now.
Yeah.
I think people come in with a lot of stuff about how they want to be remembered, and some of it is very helpful for helping them think about their values, and some of it is identity.
Yeah.
And so much has to change identity wise when people get sick
Yeah.
that, like, I think helping people have some flexibility in how they see themselves is a big part of the work with this population because, I see a lot of people who were, captains of industry who then, get sick like everybody else, like that's one of the things about this is that it doesn't, everybody, all of us will get here. Patients often ask me like, what will you do if you ever get cancer? Like, well, something's going to get all of us.
Yeah.
And so this process, like the people who really hold on to their identity around it tend to have a harder time being able to think about how they want to show up today
Yeah.
and what's right in front of them here. I think people want to focus on the end of life. They want to focus on kind of how they'll be remembered, but those are things that aren't here yet.
Yeah. That is so, like, for me, that is so useful to be reminded that sometimes we talk about things in the future and, well, how do you want to be remembered and questions like that. And I hear you talking all the time about what is within our control and what is outside of our control. And what we can control is like how we show up today and tomorrow, how we show up tomorrow. I really like that focus of showing up and doing what is within your control. You also said before that, like, when you get this diagnosis, so much is really outside of your control, and giving people control of the life that they have left is just, I love this. I love this perspective, and I really love this values piece. There's our good friend Francesca also saying, this is so beautiful. I cannot picture, not even in myself, the ability to do it, let alone transmit it to others. So it's very powerful stuff. And thank you. Francesca said, Ricky taught us well. She's one of my students. Thank you so
I
much.
am sure that is true, Francesca.
And so Jennifer, I wanted to ask you if you have any like personal experience with cancer.
Well, I think we all do. Or not all, probably, but I mean, that's one of the things about being a human being is that we will all have these experiences ourselves, or unless we are killed very suddenly. And all of the, the people that we love, many of them will have these types of experiences. So I have been treating cancer patients and had this focus since 2002. I first started doing research in this area in early 2000s, and have been sort of working exclusively with cancer patients since 2007. In 2016, my husband actually was diagnosed with advanced stage 4 head and neck cancer. He had tonsil cancer. I was actually, I don't know, do you know Ingrid Ord? So I was, when he was diagnosed, well, he had a lump in his neck that I asked him to get looked at because of my job. And we sort of made this deal for him to get it looked at. And he got it looked at, and the doctor said, come back in a couple weeks if it's still there. And in that couple weeks, it just happened that I went to South Africa to visit Ingrid and to do, I had done some, I had previously been very involved in the Developing Nations Committee in ACBS and had done some stuff and was helping Ingrid become a trainer and was out there to sort of research for a project. And while I was in South Africa, my husband's physician said, you know what, I don't like it. We should get a biopsy. So I couldn't change my flight. My husband was getting a biopsy while I was in South Africa. And by the time I got home, they had said that they didn't think it was cancerous. And then the next day after I got home, we found out that it was. And I had a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old at the time. And so that first experience, that was actually my family's first experience with cancer, not our only experience with cancer. But
I just wanted to tell you, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but Ingrid she's in the comments. She's watching
oh,
you right now.
oh,
So I thought, yeah, this is worth interrupting you. Ingrid is with us,
hi, Ingrid.
listening and watching you right now, and she is in awe,
Oh,
as we
she
all
is.
are. Yes.
I adore her. So yes, while I was hanging out with Ingrid and her lovely husband Kit, my husband was, as Ingrid and Kit knew at the time, because I was pretty worried. But in the end, his treatment was really rough. He lost a significant amount of weight. But knock on wood, that was 5 years ago, and he's doing great. You might know him. He's also sort of in our community. He's a kind of old school functional analytic psychotherapy researcher. His name is Glenn Callahan, and he's not shy about. I mean, he's not private about. I'm not disclosing something about him that he is super private about. But so that was extremely impactful. But again, my work with cancer patients sort of predated that. And so the hardest part for me was kind of figuring out how to be the wife
Yeah.
and not a cancer therapist,
Yeah.
which, we figured out pretty quickly. And as I said, he's doing well. And then a little bit tougher to talk about, in January of this year, my son was diagnosed with leukemia. My son is 14, and he is in the middle of a 2.5 year very extremely intensive treatment. So again, partly the task is figuring out how to be mom. When my son was diagnosed, the first thing I did is I work full time as a professor, and that's my sort of day job. And then I've always worked at this cancer center 20 hours a week on the side. And so when my son was diagnosed, I actually quit my cancer job because he needed a lot more care. And so, yeah, I think for both my husband and my son, in some ways, like people in our lives often comment on the irony that I study and treat cancer patients and have two family members who have gone through it. Although I will just say, like, there are no unscathed lives. I mean, both of my people have had this experience very young, and so that is unusual. But it's not unusual to have people that you care about have serious illness. Like, I think if we've learned nothing else in the last year and a half, you just don't know what's going to happen. Like the vast number of people who've lost people to COVID, or who've had prolonged illness from COVID, or from all kinds of other things. Like, this is just what it is to be a human, is that people in your life have these struggles. And I think the process for me has been extremely helpful, especially with my son, because like that, his terror is my terror. That was the case with my husband, but in a different way. My husband was an adult. So having my youngest child sick definitely changes. Like if there was anything that I could do to trade places with him, I would.
Yeah.
And I will say, it is just in case it's reassuring, like it is not necessary. He is handling it extremely well. He is just, I always knew he was a tough little guy, but I just know it in a different way now.
And so, how are you handling? I can say to people, like, before we went on here, I knew this, and we were talking about whether you would want to talk about it or not, and we would know today, like you'd had the choice to talk about it today or not, because you never
Yeah.
know where you are at in this.
Sometimes I can talk about it, and
Yeah.
sometimes I can't.
So
Um,
what made you choose to like, so I'm like, we're honored that you're sharing this with us both about around your husband and then about your around your son. What like what is it that make you choose to talk to us about it today?
I think just you. I feel really comfortable. You and I don't know each other terribly well before this, and so I don't. It's not something that I necessarily hide. He's 14, so I asked his permission before I made the decision about whether or not to talk about it today. He is very private. He has asked me not to put it on social media or have any larger larger sort of experience of talking about it. He's not that worried about this because psychologists talking to each other was not that worrisome to him or therapists. But I think, yeah, I just think I didn't, you and I don't know each other terribly well. And I think one thing that I feel pretty strongly about in terms of this work, and particularly in terms of how my experience is with my family, is that I have a lot more flexibility with avoidance than I did before. I think in ACT, we sometimes can believe that avoidance itself is bad. And the reality is, when I am waiting for results to find out about the treatment effectiveness for my son, those are not moments. Sometimes I'm going to meditate. I have a very consistent meditation practice that I've had for years. Sometimes I have the space to do that. And sometimes I need to read a magazine and, or a novel and just not be in that all the time. Yeah. And so I think for me, people who don't have a lot of contact with values, I think this work is so powerful because it really gives you a place that you have some control. But I'm pretty steeped in my values. And so I feel, for me, whether or not to talk about it has a lot to do with whether or not it feels meaningful to talk about.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
you just have been so lovely that I think that I feel comfortable doing it, but also that this is a meaningful conversation it feels like we're having.
and that you are in front of the most amazing group as well. Like people here
I
are
hear
very
that.
compassionate and kind and loving, and there's hearts and hearts and hearts coming after you right now. Thank you, Agata. Agata is saying thank you, Jen, for sharing, and there's hearts. So how like so when you talk about you knowing cancer, you really know cancer on so many
Yeah. I
levels.
haven't
So
had it.
you haven't
So,
had it, but the people around you've had, and you've been
yeah.
working with this since about 18 years. And so, um, what, just out of curiosity, what are your values now? As because you said like you have to figure out how to be not a cancer therapist, but a partner and a mom. How are you showing up to this? Like, what are the values that are that you uh, live out as a partner, as a mom during these difficult times? I know your husband is kind of out of he's better, but and
Right.
how are you? What are your values as a partner, as a mom?
That's a great question. And I would say in his experience, there were really scary moments. And unfortunately, in my son's experience, we've had many scary moments. Um, and I think in those parts, my highest value is to be, all the things I always want to be as a mom: loving, like connected, present, listening, like, really caring. Um, but also, I would say, just as part of the person, like, especially with my son, who's kind of in charge, like, he looks to me often to see whether or not he needs to be worried. And so, and he and I have always been extremely close. And so the process of like knowing, like, not my values now are not only around being a mom, but also around how I take care of myself, so that when something scary is going on, which has happened a few times where we've had very significant complications that have been extremely terrifying, that I can stay present to him and explain to him what we need to be attending to without bringing my own reactivity or bringing as little of my own reactivity as possible. Because I have a lot of reactivity. This is my heart walking around outside my body. I don't want him to be hurting or have scary things happening. And so, some of it is just my values are around taking a lot of care of myself. Am I remembering right, Rikke, that you have kids or a son?
I do. Two boys. Yeah.
How old are they?
They are 14 and 18.
Mm,
Yeah. And I really, this resonates with me, this part about, so we haven't experienced cancer on this close, but I have in my family and,
right,
friends and all that. But it resonates with me when you're saying this about that you want to be able to like feel scared, feel sad, but you are also mindful about the fact that your child is looking at you,
yeah,
checking whether they need to worry about our reactions. I think
right,
this is so profound in finding a way, because I always talk about like there's no way we can create a world where people don't suffer.
right,
And I think that is so important to so there's I cannot guarantee like my kids will suffer, but I can try and create an environment where they feel safe enough to share this with me,
right,
and not afraid of my reaction, of trying to belittle it or saying that it's nothing to be afraid of or whatever it is. So I think
right,
this what you're talking about right now is so profound, like not only carrying our own emotions, but being mindful about what we're modeling to our children and what responsibility sometimes our children are taking for our stuff.
right. And that is especially the case when what is happening to him breaks my heart.
Yes.
Not as it does when we're parents, right? With lots of things.
Yes.
When bad things happen to your kids, it
Yeah.
does affect you.
Yes.
We had a brief period where it looked like there was something really, really scary going on. And so, every cell in my body was just worried about holding myself upright and trying not to scream. And, he's looking at me to say, Mom, am I going to be okay? And, what I have to do in that moment, sometimes I'm better at, sometimes I'm not, is take a breath, wiggle my toes, check to see where I am, and realize that all that is happening in this particular moment is that he and I are talking.
Yeah.
That's it. Like, that's all that's happening. No, but whatever, my husband and I often say to each other, like, you know what? Right now, he's upstairs playing a video game. That's
Yeah.
what's happening right now. Like,
Yeah.
he's not, something more than that is not what's happening right now. Like, right in this moment, everybody's okay.
I think this is like when I'm listening back. I don't know if you can say that. When I'm listening back to the conversation that you and I had, I think one of the things that really strikes me is how much attention you are paying to the present moment, and I can see how that could be difficult in a situation where like the
Yeah.
one that you guys are in and that we often sometimes find ourselves in. But I hear that you are coming back to the present moment. Right now, he's playing a video game. Right now, I'm having a conversation with my son. The woman
Right.
in the bed that you were telling me about, right now, you're in your bed contacting fear and sadness and etc. And I think that is just it's such a beautiful modeling and it's such a great reminder for us all really really really. There's a question here for you. uh, Oh, so somebody says here, Agata says, if it's not too private, and you mentioned a little bit about meditation, but how do you take care of yourself? Is meditating your daily thing to do?
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so. I spend a lot of time meditating, especially I think in some ways since COVID, it's
Yeah.
been easier to be consistent in some ways because I'm home more. I mean, I'm home more because of my son, but I think in some ways, yes, I have a very active meditation practice. I am part of a Buddhist Sangha, like a meditation center. I have like I'm pretty. I I think for me, in a very non a very secular way, the connection to meditation and returning to the present is, I think, historically was just really important for my work, for me not to, you know, sort of carry that around all the time. And then, certainly in the last 5 years, coping with what's happened in my family and larger things, like it definitely, for me, it has been powerful. And I think, like, we called this acting in life's scariest moments. I'm not sure if when things don't feel so scary that that will feel as necessary for me all the time, but it is definitely a pretty we might say crucial around here part of my life.
Yeah.
There's going to be some freaking out moms.
Yeah. And so, Jen, we're at the very end of this, and so we'll be logging off in just a minute, and I'm going to ask you to stay here with me because you and I are just going to clean up the bar. And so, and I just wanted to really thank you um, for showing us how one can show up to every moment in life, even the scariest ones. Like, I, and this might sound crazy, but I would want you to hold my hand on, those hours, really, really. And I'm so honored that you're choosing to share what is going on in your family with your son and your husband, and we all wish you well. And if you could see, like, there's so much love coming in here. Um, Ingrid saying thank you so much, Jen. There's the hearts from Kiki, Lena. There's so many hearts coming in here, and I ask you to come back and go and watch the comments. And also, guys, if you have questions, and we didn't really spend a lot of time on questions, we're so absorbed in this. Feel free to come in and ask questions, and if any of us can answer them, we'd be happy to do that. But I
Yeah,
wanted to encourage you guys to send the love for Jen. And so afterwards, after having this conversation, that Jen can always go back and see the comments and see the love that you are sending to her. So everybody, we're so honored that you choose to come in here on this. I know many of you are in Scandinavia and it's evening, and some of you
yeah.
are, it's in the morning. And I know for the folks in Australia, they will watch this later because that's in the middle of the night. So thank you everybody for joining us again. Please send your hearts and love in the comments for Jen. We wish you and your family all the best. And then we're going to log off, and then we're just going to clean up the bar. So bye,
Thank you, Ricky.
guys. Thank you,
Bye, guys.
guys. Bye.